Welcome to Understanding and Addressing Vicarious Trauma. In today's session, we're going to be talking about a few things. The first is we're going to define what vicarious trauma is. We're going to talk about how it affects us and what it looks like. We're also going to talk about how we as individuals can address it, as well as how our places of work, organizations, can adopt strategies to also address vicarious trauma. My name is Jessica Kendall, and I'm a senior manager at ICF. At ICF, I work on a range of projects that touch social and human service systems, education, workforce, and anti-trafficking. Prior to joining to ICF, I actually represented children as an attorney in child protection proceedings. It is during that time that I truly became passionate and knowledgeable about the topic that we're going to be talking about today. This training is incredibly important for those who work in TANF, as well as other social service systems. It's important for the participants and customers with whom you work. It's important for their families. It's even important for your community. There are so many men and women and children and families that touch TANF and other human service systems every day. Your program plays a vital role in providing them support and services they need to get back on their feet and to support their families. But this work is not easy by any means. You may work long hours or even on weekends at times. There may be times where you sort of feel like you're on call in support of the customers and families with whom you work. You may hear or see or learn about really significant adversities in your customers' lives. Your caseloads at times might be high. You might be putting out fire after fire after fire. And doing so at times with really limited resources, support, or funding. But you probably do this for a reason too. You probably do the work you do because you care. It may be something personal or professional, something that's happened in your life that has driven you to want to help others. And it's this mission and dedication to improve lives that likely brings you here to this discussion today. So why is this important? Why are we talking about vicarious trauma? Well, a traumatized staff, or alternatively an organization that's not trauma-informed, may experience several of the things you see listed on this slide. You might see high churn and turnover among staff. They might be out of work often for physical or other health-related issues. You may see a decrease among staff in terms of their motivation to do the work. And importantly, staff who might be experiencing trauma or an organization that's not effectively supporting them might see degradation in the relationships that form between staff and the very customers that you serve. And so that inability to manage and support, to build rapport and trust in those relationships may fall away. And in doing so, decreases the effectiveness with which you work with TANF participants. So before we talk about strategies on addressing vicarious trauma, we need to define what we're talking about. But before we even talk about what vicarious trauma is, we need to know what trauma is. By its very definition, trauma is an emotional response to what would be considered an objectively terrible event. I want to note that that experience of trauma itself, though, is subjective. It's the emotional response to what would be a difficult adverse event. So two people might be exposed to the exact same event that would be objectively considered to be traumatizing, but they may respond entirely differently. One might have a trauma response, and the other may not at all. There are many different types of potentially traumatic experiences, and a few are noted here on this slide. Whether that be domestic abuse, child abuse and neglect, natural disasters, a car accident, some other sort of traumatic injury, vicarious trauma, which we'll be talking about today, and historical trauma. Historical trauma is something that impacts entire communities. It's sort of the cumulative emotional wounding as a result of traumatic experiences that can transmit across generations within a community. This can be associated with racial ethnic populations in the United States who may have suffered intergenerational losses and assault on their culture and well-being. Native American communities might be an example. Holocaust survivors and their children and grandchildren may be another. There's been more focus on historical trauma in more recent years, in part because of a growing body of research called epigenetics. In this research, there's really early indicators of the possibility that there are epigenetic markers of trauma that can be passed literally from one generation to the next, increasing that next generation's susceptibility to things like PTSD if their parents or even grandparents suffered from it. So what is vicarious trauma? We said before that trauma is that emotional response to an objectively terrible event. Well, vicarious trauma is our emotional response to bearing witness to another's trauma. So it's not the event, again, itself, but it's that emotional toll that we carry by being exposed. Now, whether you experience this level of trauma, it can stem from exposure to a single instance, or it could be in response to an accumulated exposure to others' pain. Some call it the cost of caring. But it too, just like trauma, can be pervasive. It can impact all parts of your life, where individuals who may experience symptoms similar to PTSD. It too is subjective, just like trauma. So two individuals facing the same exposure to another's traumatic experience, one might experience vicarious trauma, the other may not. It's important to note that vicarious trauma is fundamentally different, though, from burnout. Burnout is the result of prolonged stress, frustration, that might result in physical or even emotional exhaustion, but it tends to be associated kind of exclusively with the workplace and can be fixed or resolved by taking some time off or even changing jobs. But it doesn't necessarily change one's worldview, or is it associated with PTSD type symptoms? So, who's at risk of experiencing vicarious trauma? Well, people who work, or for that matter, volunteer in victim services, human services, who are in the military, first responders, are all at increased risk for experiencing vicarious trauma. But also those who regularly listen, hear, or review traumatic events or violence. These risk factors will increase vulnerability. But I want to encourage, as you're listening to some of these, to think about which may or may not apply to you. Because it's important that we all know our own protective and risk factors as they relate to vicarious trauma to help mitigate against it. So when looking at this slide, you can see some factors that may be either risk or protective, depending on how they play out in your work experience. Caseload, for example. Are your responsibilities clearly defined? Do they match your interests and skills? Is there a sharing of sort of the hardest cases? Or do they all sit with one person? So see, these different elements of your caseload experience may pose either a risk or be protective in whether or not you experience vicarious trauma. The culture of the agency within which you work. Is there no tolerance for errors? no recognition for good work done? Or is there recognition? Are you given the opportunity to provide feedback, to change policies, programs? Is there training and support for staff at all levels? Availability of supervision. How do your supervisors coach, support, motivate employees? Are there built-in opportunities to check in, and more than just on a specific task or project? Do staff feel comfortable confiding in supervisors if they do feel some sense of stress or adversity or uncertainty at work? What kind of assistance, health, wellness resources are offered and available to staff? There are also risk and protective factors that relate to our personal experience. Again, I'd encourage you as we talk through some of these to think about which might apply to you, if any. A really important personal factor that might affect the likelihood that someone experiences vicarious trauma is their coping style, their temperament. What's your normal response to stress? You become anxious? Are you energized? Are you pensive? Are you empathetic by nature or more prone to sort of carry the weight of others' traumas? Have you experienced trauma yourself and maybe not fully resolved those experiences? That may increase the likelihood that you're more prone to experience vicarious trauma. There is some research that suggests that women are more likely to experience vicarious trauma than men. Then our life circumstances. Are you happy at work? Are you happy at home? Is there conflict or strife in your home life or community? Major life changes too, whether that's a move, a new job, a new relationship, can also increase the potential risk, if they're causing stress, of experiencing vicarious trauma. Certainly too, a history of depression or anxiety may also increase that risk. There also may be times where your professional experiences sort of act as a protective factor, where your personal experiences may act as a risk factor, or vice versa. If one of those areas of your life may be causing stress or adversity, the other may be compensating because it's going well. But if both are suffering, you may be more prone or at risk for experience vicarious trauma. So what does this look like? On this slide, we sort of articulate some of what would be considered some of the more common symptoms of vicarious trauma, as well as the effects that they might have on different facets of our life. Disconnected. You may feel avoidant or want to shy away from the people, the places, the things that remind you of that traumatic event. You might be irritable. People with vicarious trauma may feel jumpy or antsy, kind of on edge. And this can be due to sort of that general level of high stress that they may be experiencing. When you're operating in that state of high stress, you might be more prone to flee, to fight, to freeze. You may experience flashbacks. People who have vicarious trauma may have difficulty sleeping due to sort of intrusive thoughts or images about the traumatic event that they bore witness to. It could happen while you're reading or even in a quiet moment. It could be triggered by a smell or a sound or even a taste. And it doesn't always replay the experience that you witnessed. And sometimes your mind may wander into a dark place where you translate those feelings of stress and trauma into different dark thoughts, maybe the loss of a loved one or a terrible injury that might befall you or a loved one. These symptoms can affect both how we think, how we engage, how we feel, and our emotions. Cognitively, it can affect our ability to think critically, to think rationally. Socially, we might reduce our sort of desire to collaborate. We might have difficulty trusting. We might isolate from family, friends, or other supports in our lives. Emotionally, we might have feelings of hopelessness, of distrust, or even a shift in our worldview. Before experiencing vicarious trauma, you might have fundamentally believed that the world is a decent and good place. Individuals who experience vicarious trauma sometimes experience a shift in that view. And there might be physical ramifications for experiencing vicarious trauma as well. They have more aches and pains, more illness. Certainly, each of these effects can affect how you function at home, at work, and at school. But it's also important to note that you may experience vicarious trauma, but not have all of these, or maybe you just have one. Just like whether you experience vicarious trauma or not is completely subjective and based on a whole host of factors, so too is the manner in which it exhibits. So you might experience a certain level of disconnection or irritability, but that doesn't mean necessarily that you're underperforming at work. In fact, you might be overperforming. You might be hyper efficient in your job. So cognitively, you continue to operate at the level that you were before, if not even greater, but maybe physically, you have more illness, more aches and pains. You're exhausted at the end of each day. You're falling asleep at 7:30 at night. And so it's important to note that the effects of vicarious trauma can be highly variable from person to person, and it's important to sort of just know your body and your mind and how you best operate when you're feeling resilient. So what does this mean? Does this mean we're all burned out? That we all have vicarious trauma? We all need to quit our jobs and move to a desert island like you see on this slide? Well, realistically, most of us can't. And most of us probably aren't experiencing vicarious trauma. We might have some levels of stress and adversity in our lives, but not so far as experiencing the diagnosis of vicarious trauma. But regardless, we all need to, at times, pull upon our own capacity for resiliency and strength and build upon them. We also may need to be really clear on identifying and setting boundaries for ourselves to help reduce stress and even the likelihood of experiencing burnout or vicarious trauma. But in order to set those boundaries, we need to know what we need, what we really need to be happy and healthy. So in this discussion today, I am not going to tell you to take a bath or do yoga or write in a journal. But I do want to encourage you to think about what you feel you need at work to make yourself feel a sense of compassion, satisfaction. And what this may mean for you is highly personal. It may draw upon your own experiences, not just at work, but at home and even when you were growing up. What do I mean by this? Well, maybe you're one of a couple kids and you were the middle child. And growing up, you always wanted a lot of attention that you didn't feel like you were getting. You yearned for that recognition and that positive reinforcement from your parents. And so perhaps that's what you're seeking now at work too. You thrive on that acknowledgement of a job well done, of that positive reinforcement. So as we walk through some of the strategies that we're going to talk about in the next several slides, I really want to urge you to think about, what do you need? What do you need to get your needs met in work, and at home. And once you understand those, they will be the driver for your own self-care and resiliency strategies. So what is resiliency? It's the capacity of an individual to adapt successfully to a significant challenge that might threaten his or her functioning, viability, or development. Resiliency does not exist without adversity. But it's not a character trait. This is something we can learn and be taught. It is also, just like the trauma experience or vicarious trauma experience itself, is highly subjective. It is time and context dependent. You may feel resilient in one area of your life, maybe at home, but maybe not so in work, or vice versa. You might feel resilient at one point in time, but it doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to feel resilient in the next moment in time, in the same situation. For those of you who might have kids, you might have days where your patience knows no bounds, and you're highly resilient to whatever your kids might be experiencing, be able to support them in a way that they need. And then the very next day, your patience has worn thin. And you can't control maybe your own emotion, or maybe get angry or yell. Same situation, the kids aren't acting any differently. Your capacity for resilience may have changed. How and when we are resilient depends on a range of factors, from our families and friends' supports to community, to learned skills, to our inner strength. Resilience is not a magical quality. It takes real hard work to transcend hardship. But after misfortune or adversity, resilient people are able to change course. They move towards achieving whatever goals they had set for themselves. And there is research and evidence that elements of resilience, as I said before, they can be cultivated, they can be taught. Studies show that strengths like gratitude, kindness, hope actually act as protective factors against life's adversities. They help us adapt to the difficulties we may face. In one study, hope and bravery were most likely correlated with positive adaptation skills in the face of challenge. This led the researchers to believe that things like emotional regulation and determination were possible because of those capacities towards hope and bravery. Optimism, too, can help blunt the impact of stress on our minds and our bodies. It gives people access to their own cognitive resources. It enables that cool-headed analysis to be able to say, what went wrong? What is my path forward to be more productive? Culture also is uniquely tied to resilience because it affects what we within our own community see as acceptable resiliency responses. For example, in some communities, what might be considered a legitimate health or mental health concern may vary. In some communities, it would be taboo to raise certain mental health concerns and address them. So that as a resiliency strategy might not work in some communities. Even the sources of support and strength that we need to draw on to be resilient might vary from culture to culture. And so when you think about resiliency, whether this is in terms of what you can do for yourself within your job, or what you as a leader or decision maker within your organization, or do, an assessment of cultural needs and responsivity is vital to effectively implementing a fair and equitable resiliency strategy. So I want to talk first about some things that you can do for yourself in terms of addressing vicarious trauma and or implementing resiliency strategies for yourself as an individual. When I discuss these, I want to encourage you to really think about those coping strategies that have worked best for you and under what circumstances. Again, we all have the capacity to build resiliency skills. So think about a really difficult situation or challenging experience that you have. How did you respond? What strategies did you use to overcome that adversity? Draw upon those capacities to build your own strategies going forward. The first one we've noted before is the importance of boundaries. It's really important that as a part of your resiliency strategy, you're clear on what your role is at work and that there are boundaries around it. Without that clarity, you might struggle with what your responsibilities are. You might think about these boundaries too, not just respect to your roles and responsibilities at work, but also your interactions with customers. What boundaries do you need to set in those interactions to decrease work-related stressors, but also to help you do your job better? This might relate to the level at which you feel comfortable sharing your own experiences, or perhaps your availability outside of what would be normal working hours for you. I would also encourage you to put work into perspective. Remember that what you do is part of a much bigger picture in safety net services. That you are working towards supporting your customers, and sometimes there are decisions made that you might not agree with, that may also be outside of your control. Unwind. What do you do each day to detach from the stressors of work, even if it's just for a few minutes? Is there a close friend or family member that you check in with? Is there something maybe you watch on TV that's frivolous but that you enjoy? Do you watch your favorite sports teams? Do you take your dog for a walk? Is there something in your daily routine that helps you calm down from sort of the hustle and bustle and stress of work? Do you have dedicated workspace? This is particularly important today as we move between virtual and distance work and being in the office. To what extent do you have to work from home, or do you bring work home with you? Is all of your work sitting in an office, and are you able to leave it there, or do you bring it home? And if you do have to bring it home, what is the physical space that you're using to do that work? It's important that we be able to separate to some degree our living, working, and sleeping spaces as much as possible. For example, you don't want to work in bed. You don't want to work where you sleep. So having that dedicated space that you can step away from when you need to do things in your home or to relax are really important. Sleep. I feel like this should go without saying, but the less sleep you have, the harder sometimes it is for our brains and bodies to reset. Getting that 7 or even 8 hours of sleep every night gives our bodies that time we need to heal and reset so as not to get burnt out or exhausted. And finally, to connect. Maybe that's with friends or family or members of the community, but drawing upon healthy relationships to build your own resiliency. thinking about strategies for organization. What can you, perhaps as an administrator, as a decision maker within your organization, do to support resiliency strategies and trauma-informed strategies in your office? This is the 4 R's. It's something that was developed by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, SAMHSA, and part of their concept of creating a trauma-informed approach. For an organization to effectively address trauma and vicarious trauma within the organization, they need to first realize the impact that trauma or vicarious trauma have on staff and on customers. They need to be able to recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma or vicarious trauma. They need to then integrate that knowledge into practice and policy, and then seek ways to resist the possibility of re-traumatization through the very practices and policies that you're implementing. So what does this mean practically for an organization? On these next few slides, I'm going to share a few tips with respect to each of these 4 R's. When we talk about realizing the impacts of trauma and its prevalence, doing what we're doing right now is a first step. Offering training, ongoing training and supports and information about the prevalence of trauma, what it means, how it affects us, and strategies to address it. And not just for certain levels of the organization, but really for all, whether that's new or incumbent workers, whether that's your frontline staff or your leadership. Giving this learning an opportunity to understand and realize what trauma is across an organization is truly the first step in becoming trauma-informed. But beyond that, it's about staff capacity building. Now that we know what this is and what it means, how can we build competencies to recognize it, both amongst staff but also customers? And this does not mean, nor should it, that human service agencies or TANF programs should be in the business of treating trauma. What is being suggested here is not some sort of trauma-specific intervention that you are able to recognize or address. You're not conducting therapy. But the idea here is to be able to acknowledge and understand what some of those symptoms are, what they look like, how they might affect your customers and your staff's ability to participate in programs or do their jobs. And then changing policy and practices to support that. There are many different facets across an organization that programs might think about in terms of how to implement new approaches to address trauma. On this slide, I've just identified a few, but there are others to consider in more depth, whether that's training, capacity building for staff, monitoring and evaluation, finances and resources, governance structures. There are many different sort of infrastructural elements across an organization that can and should be assessed in thinking about how to effectively address and combat vicarious trauma within an organization. That being said, I've identified 2 here that I want to reflect on. The first is supervision. What are ways that an organization might promote and implement the supervisory approach that includes resiliency strategies and addresses vicarious trauma? Well, one is reflective supervision. This is sort of that collaborative relationship that supports professional growth, that helps improve program quality by identifying and honoring the strengths that staff have and creating a relationship of partnership to promote growth in challenge areas. So it offers an opportunity to not just focus on the task at hand, which is important, but also allows a supervisor and supervisee to sort of step back from that immediate experience from time to time to support the expression of thoughts and feelings that would drive professional growth. In essence, it's sort of building relationships of trust where the supervisor is using sort of close observation, their own self-awareness to support staff. There's also an important task that supervisors take in sort of monitoring caseloads across all of their staff. Who may need additional supervision in times of potentially high risk or stress at work? How are the caseloads distributed across staff? Are some carrying the most difficult cases and others are not? Or are they spread across everyone? And that might affect the level of supervision and support that different staff members receive. What kind of mentorship or support opportunities are sort of baked into that supervisor-supervisee relationship? And are there opportunities, again, as a part of that reflective supervision process, to plan together, to spend a moment and talk about that staff person's own goals and hopes for their work and passion? With respect to policies that your organization has that might support resiliency and address vicarious trauma, certainly having access to and making staff aware of any employee assistance and mental health resources is really important. Having defined formal procedures to reduce the risk of stress in the workplace, particularly for those who might be carrying difficult caseloads. Having a defined formal policy for staff who are reporting high levels of stress, but also including staff, and staff at all levels, in designing and implementing a stress prevention practice. And this actually goes across the organization. An organization that is resiliency focused, that seeks to be trauma informed, includes staff at all levels helping to design and implement both programs and policies that affect what they do in their day-to-day. Another policy of note is taking an organizational assessment. So organizations that are truly interested in becoming trauma-informed and implementing resiliency strategies should take an assessment of where they stand, where are their needs. Maybe their needs are in supervision or policies, or maybe they're not. Maybe they're in governance or other structures or monitoring or financial or support needs. Finally, organizations need to resist or butt up against approaches that may inadvertently re-traumatize either staff or customers. Some approaches that may re-traumatize include those listed on this slide. Again, if there aren't clear roles or boundaries or responsibilities for staff, that might not only re-traumatize staff who've experienced vicarious trauma, but it might also decrease their ability to work effectively with customers. Supervisory strategies that aren't strength-based, that aren't resiliency-focused, or don't provide sufficient supervision to begin with, may too inadvertently re-traumatize. Certainly, processes that are inefficient, repetitive, whether that's for the customer or for staff, that increases that administrative burden that makes it harder for staff to perhaps do their primary job, can also re-traumatize. An organization that doesn't acknowledge some of these challenges or other challenges that staff face might also increase the risk and likelihood that staff experience burnout or vicarious trauma. And certainly spending time acknowledging success and celebrating it Those who don't do so may also increase the likelihood of re-traumatization. This slide shares a few resources for you to sort of dive in a little more deeply on assessing your needs as an individual, as well as your organization's needs. So the first resources for individuals include a self-assessment to assess the extent to which you might be feeling or experiencing stress or even vicarious trauma in your work. And the second is a starter kit to help guide you through an assessment of your own self-care strategies and resiliency supports. The second is for organizations to assess the extent to which they have addressed vicarious trauma or not, or areas for improvement, as well as guidance on different facets of an organization to assess the support resiliency strategy. I want to thank you for your time today and for your listening to this session on addressing vicarious trauma. Thank you.